You had breakfast this morning. Maybe it was bacon and eggs. You scrolled through your phone, passing ads that did not feel like ads. You saw news stories shaped by people you will never meet. You absorbed opinions that felt like your own, even though the groundwork for those opinions may have been laid decades before you were born. You drove past billboards. You watched a product review that may have been quietly funded by the company being reviewed. You formed an impression of a political candidate based on a feeling you could not fully explain. And none of this is accidental. In one way or another, many of these moments trace back to one man, a man most people have never heard of, but whose ideas helped build the world we live in today. His name was Edward Bernays. He was born in Vienna in 1891 and died in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1995 at the age of 103. Between those two dates, Bernays helped create the modern machinery of persuasion. He changed the way companies sell products. He changed the way politicians shape public opinion. He changed the way governments, corporations, and institutions communicate with the public. And perhaps most unsettling of all, he wrote openly about what he was doing. He explained it plainly, confidently, and without apology. He called it the engineering of consent. Others would call it propaganda. The family connection that shaped his thinking. To understand Edward Bernays, you first have to understand his family. Bernays was born in Vienna to Elie Bernays and Anna Freud Bernays. His mother was the sister of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. His father was the brother of Freud's wife, Martha Bernays. That made Edward Bernays doubly connected to Freud. This was not a distant family connection. Freud's ideas about the unconscious mind, hidden desires, irrational impulses, and the forces beneath human behavior were part of the intellectual world Bernays grew up around. Later, Bernays would take those ideas and apply them not to therapy but to mass persuasion. In 1892, when Edward was still an infant, the Bernays family moved from Vienna to New York City. His father worked as a grain exporter at the Manhattan Produce Exchange, and Edward grew up in a comfortable middle-class household. He attended DeWitt Clinton High School, then went to Cornell University, where he graduated in 1912 with a degree in agriculture. Agriculture. Not psychology. Not politics. Not marketing. But Bernays was never truly interested in farming. What fascinated him was influence. How do you get people to act? How do you shape what they think? How do you make them want something? After Cornell, Bernays tried several jobs. He wrote briefly for the National Nurseryman. He worked with his father at the Produce Exchange. He spent time in Paris reading grain cables for Louis Dreyfus and Company. None of it held his attention for long. Then, in late 1912, he returned to New York and found his first real lesson in the power of public perception. The play that taught him the power of framing. Bernays became co-editor of two small publications, Medical Review of Reviews and Dietetic and Hygienic Gazette. Through those medical journals, he discovered the power of framing. One of his earliest projects involved a controversial French play called Damaged Goods, written by Eugene Brieux. The play dealt with syphilis, a topic considered deeply taboo in polite society at the time. No respectable New York theater wanted to touch it. But Bernays saw an opportunity. Instead of promoting the play as entertainment, he reframed it as a public health issue. He organized a sponsorship committee made up of doctors, clergy members, and respected public figures. He positioned attending the play not as something scandalous, but as something responsible, educational, and civic-minded. And it worked. The play opened to packed houses. What could have been a public relations disaster became a success. This was one of Bernays' defining lessons. You do not simply sell people a product. You sell them a meaning. You do not only change what something is. You change what it represents. That insight, first sharpened through the promotion of a play about venereal disease, would eventually reshape the 20th century. After that early success, Bernays moved into theatrical publicity. He represented major figures in productions, including the legendary Italian tenor Enrico Caruso and the avant-garde ballets Russes. He was skilled. But soon world events would give him a much larger stage. World War I, the classroom of mass persuasion. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. President Woodrow Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, also known as the CPI or the Creel Committee, after its chairman, journalist George Creel. The committee had one massive goal: convince a skeptical American public that entering a European war was not only necessary but righteous. The message was not that America was fighting for territory, wealth, or power. The message was that America was fighting for democracy itself. Wilson's famous phrase, "Make the world safe for democracy," became one of the most powerful slogans of the era. And Edward Bernays, only 26 years old, was one of the people helping to shape that message. Bernays worked with other influential figures, including journalist Walter Lippmann and publicist Carl Baiwar. Together, they used posters, pamphlets, speeches, newspaper stories, films, and public events to build support for the war. The committee also deployed thousands of volunteer speakers known as 4-Minute Men. These speakers delivered short, carefully prepared patriotic speeches in movie theaters and public spaces across the country. It was propaganda on an industrial scale. And it worked. Public opinion shifted. Support for the war grew. Bernays watched closely and learned a lesson that would define his life. If propaganda could rally millions of people behind a war, could the same methods be used in peacetime? If people could be persuaded to sacrifice for a slogan, could they also be persuaded to buy a product, support a politician, change a habit, or adopt an entirely new way of thinking? For Bernays, the answer was yes. The birth of public relations. After the war ended in 1918, Bernays accompanied the American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. There, he saw President Wilson welcomed like a hero by crowds in Europe. Many of those people had never met Wilson. Their emotional connection to him had been created through messaging, symbolism, and media. Bernays returned to New York in 1919 and opened his own public relations firm with Doris Fleischmann, a journalist, feminist, and writer who later became his wife. Fleischmann was a remarkable figure in her own right. She was one of the first married women in the United States to receive a passport under her maiden name. She was also a member of the Lucy Stone League, which advocated for women keeping their birth names after marriage. She wrote and edited many of Bernays' memos, press releases, speeches, and books. By many accounts, she was not just his wife, but his intellectual partner and business partner. Together, Bernays and Fleischmann began applying wartime propaganda techniques to the peacetime marketplace. But Bernays did not want to call himself a propagandist. By then, the word propaganda was beginning to sound dangerous and manipulative. So he created a new professional identity. He called himself a counsel on public relations. It was a brilliant rebranding. Public relations sounded open, friendly, and democratic. It suggested a relationship between institutions and the public. But in Bernays' hands, it meant something much more strategic. The scientific shaping of public opinion. Freud, crowds, and the irrational public. Bernays did not rely only on instinct. He drew heavily from the ideas of his uncle, Sigmund Freud. Freud argued that human beings are not purely rational. Beneath conscious thought, he believed there are hidden drives, fears, desires, and impulses that shape behavior. Bernays took that idea and applied it to the marketplace. If people are moved by unconscious desires, then facts alone are not enough to persuade them. You have to reach them emotionally. You have to connect your product, candidate, or cause to something deeper than logic. But Freud was not Bernays' only influence. He also studied Gustave Le Bon, the French social psychologist who wrote The Crowd. Le Bon argued that people in crowds become more emotional, suggestible, and easily influenced. Bernays also drew from Wilfred Trotter, a British surgeon and social psychologist who wrote about the herd instinct, the human tendency to conform to group behavior. And he studied Walter Lippmann, who argued that public opinion is shaped not by direct experience, but by images, stereotypes, and simplified ideas delivered through media. From all of these influences, Bernays developed his own theory of mass persuasion. He then turned that theory into books. Crystallizing Public Opinion and Propaganda. In 1923, Bernays published Crystallizing Public Opinion. It was one of the first major books to define public relations as a professional discipline. In it, Bernays argued that the Public Relations Council was not merely a press agent. He was a specialist in understanding and shaping public attitudes. The book attracted attention from corporations, politicians, and institutions around the world. But Bernays' most famous and controversial book came 5 years later. In 1928, he published Propaganda. The title was direct. The opening argument was even more direct. Bernays wrote that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important part of democratic society. He argued that those who control this hidden mechanism form an invisible government, which he described as the true ruling power of the country. He was not hiding it. He was not apologizing. He believed that democracy required guidance from skilled opinion makers. To Bernays, the public was too emotional, too irrational, and too easily swayed to manage complex society on its own. Public relations experts, in his view, had to guide public opinion from behind the scenes. He called this process the engineering of consent. To him, it was not a corruption of democracy. It was how democracy functioned. Selling bacon as a health choice. Bernays' ideas were not just theoretical. He used them. One of his most famous campaigns was for the Beechnut Packing Company, a major producer of bacon. By the 1920s, the American breakfast was changing. Many people were moving away from large, heavy breakfasts and eating lighter meals like toast, coffee, and juice. Beechnut wanted to sell more bacon. A normal advertiser might have simply said, "Eat more bacon." Bernays did something different. He asked a company physician whether a heavier breakfast could be healthier than a light one. The doctor agreed that a heavier breakfast could help replenish the body's energy after sleep. Bernays then arranged for that doctor to contact thousands of physicians across the country, asking whether they supported the idea of a heartier breakfast. Many agreed. Bernays turned that response into a national news story. Newspapers reported that thousands of doctors recommended a hearty breakfast. And what was the classic symbol of a hearty American breakfast? Bacon and eggs. Bernays did not need to make the campaign look like an advertisement. In fact, that was the point. He created an expert-backed health narrative that led consumers directly to his client's product. Bacon sales rose. And the idea of bacon and eggs as a classic American breakfast became even more deeply rooted in American culture. Torches of freedom. The bacon campaign was impressive. But Bernays' work for the American Tobacco Company became legendary. In the 1920s, tobacco companies had a major problem. Women made up half the population, but many did not smoke publicly because of strong social taboos. Smoking in public was seen as unfeminine, immoral, or scandalous. George Washington Hill, president of the American Tobacco Company, wanted to break that taboo and expand the market. Bernays understood that this was not just about cigarettes. It was about symbolism. He consulted psychoanalyst A. A. Brill, one of Freud's followers and one of the first psychoanalysts in the United States. Brill suggested that cigarettes could be seen as symbols of male power and independence. Bernays saw the opportunity immediately. If cigarettes could be connected to women's liberation, then smoking would no longer look like a vice. It would look like a statement. On Easter Sunday, March 31, 1929, Bernays arranged for a group of fashionable young women to walk in New York City's Easter parade and light cigarettes in public. The event was presented as a women's rights demonstration. The cigarettes were called Torches of Freedom. Reporters and photographers had been tipped off in advance. Newspapers covered the event as though it were a spontaneous feminist protest. The public did not see the corporate strategy behind it. They saw women claiming freedom. The campaign helped make public smoking by women more socially acceptable and linked cigarettes to independence, rebellion, and equality. The tragedy is obvious now. Bernays helped attach a deadly product to the language of freedom. And he never smoked himself, selling fear, soap, and fashion. Bernays' methods appeared again and again in campaign after campaign. For Dixie Cup, he promoted the idea that shared drinking cups were unsanitary. He helped create a public health concern that made disposable cups seem safer and more modern. For Ivory Soap, he organized national soap carving contests for children. The campaign associated the brand with creativity, innocence, and wholesome childhood activity. For Lucky Strike, he helped make green fashionable because the cigarette package was green. He organized a green ball, encouraged designers to feature green, and pushed fashion editors and department stores to promote the color. In each case, Bernays was not simply advertising. He was reshaping the environment around the product. He created conditions in which buying the product felt natural, modern, healthy, patriotic, fashionable, or liberating. That was his genius. And that was also the danger. Politicians as products. Bernays also understood something that would become central to modern politics. In the age of mass media, politicians could be packaged like consumer goods. In 1924, he helped improve the public image of President Calvin Coolidge, who was widely seen as stiff and humorless. Bernays organized a breakfast at the White House with vaudeville performers, including Al Jolson and the Dolly Sisters. Newspapers covered the event, and Coolidge appeared warmer and more human. One famous headline suggested that the president had nearly laughed. The message was clear. A politician's image could be managed. A personality could be repackaged. A public feeling could be manufactured. Bernays later taught the first university course on public relations at New York University and published more than a dozen books. He was not only practicing public relations. He was building the profession itself. Guatemala and the power of manufactured fear. The darkest chapter in Bernays' career involved Guatemala and the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita Brands International. During the first half of the 20th century, United Fruit was one of the most powerful corporations in the Western Hemisphere. It owned vast plantations, railroads, ports, and communication systems across Central America and the Caribbean. In Guatemala, the company controlled enormous amounts of land. Locals called it El Pulpo, the octopus, because its influence reached into nearly every part of national life. United Fruit hired Bernays in the early 1940s. At first, his job was to promote bananas in the United States. He linked bananas to health, modern nutrition, and American family life. He also helped create the Middle America Information Bureau, which supplied journalists, academics, and officials with information favorable to United Fruit. But then Guatemala changed. In 1944, a popular uprising ended the dictatorship of Jorge Ubico. The country held democratic elections, and Juan José Arevalo became president. His administration introduced social reforms, including labor rights and expanded democratic freedoms. In 1951, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman became president and pushed an ambitious land reform program. His government redistributed uncultivated land from large estates to landless peasants, many of them indigenous Guatemalans. United Fruit was one of the largest landowners affected. The Guatemalan government offered compensation based on the land values the company itself had declared for tax purposes. United Fruit argued the land was worth far more. The company turned to Bernays. Bernays turned to fear. His strategy was to frame Arbenz as a communist threat. This was the early Cold War, and anti-communist anxiety in the United States was intense. Bernays understood that if Guatemala could be portrayed as a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, American politicians, journalists, and the public would respond emotionally. He distributed reports to members of Congress and influential opinion leaders. He sent newsletters to journalists. He arranged guided trips to Guatemala for American reporters, paid for by United Fruit, where they were shown the version of the country the company wanted them to see. The narrative spread. Newspapers warned of communist influence in Guatemala. Politicians repeated the message. The interests of a fruit company became entangled with the language of national security. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation Success. A small force led by exiled Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas invaded Guatemala with U.S. backing. The operation relied heavily on psychological warfare, radio propaganda, rumors, and pressure on the Guatemalan military. On June 27, 1954, President Arbenz resigned. Castillo Armas took power with U.S. support. Land reforms were reversed. United Fruit's interests were protected. Guatemala entered decades of authoritarian rule and civil conflict. The civil war that followed lasted 36 years and cost an estimated 200,000 lives, most of them indigenous Guatemalans. Bernays did not personally lead the coup, but his propaganda campaign helped create the atmosphere in which it became politically possible. That is the terrifying power of manufactured consent. You do not always need bullets. Sometimes all you need is a story repeated often enough by enough trusted voices, until fear does the rest. Bernays and Nazi propaganda. There is another disturbing part of Bernays' legacy. In 1933, Bernays learned that Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, had reportedly kept Bernays' book Crystallizing Public Opinion in his propaganda library and used it while shaping Nazi messaging against German Jews. Bernays was Jewish. According to his own autobiography, the news shocked him. But his reflection on it was limited. He wrote that any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for antisocial ones. That was his answer. The tools, in his view, were neutral. The morality depended on the person using them. But that raises a serious question. Can tools designed to manipulate mass opinion ever be morally neutral? Once you teach governments, corporations, and political movements how to bypass reason and speak directly to fear, desire, insecurity, and identity, can you really control where that knowledge goes? Bernays seemed to believe the answer was yes. History suggests otherwise. The philosophy behind the machine. The most disturbing thing about Edward Bernays is not one campaign. It is the philosophy underneath all of them. He believed the public was irrational. He believed society needed experts to guide opinion. He believed consent could be engineered. And he believed this was not only acceptable but necessary. In 1955, Bernays published The Engineering of Consent, where he continued to argue that shaping public opinion was central to democratic life. His critics strongly disagreed. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter once described Bernays and fellow publicist Ivy Lee as professional poisoners of the public mind. The 2002 BBC documentary The Century of the Self, directed by Adam Curtis, portrayed Bernays as a deeply undemocratic figure. Other critics called him a modern Machiavelli. And yet, Bernays' influence kept growing. By the time he died in 1995, his methods had become so common that they were almost invisible. That was the point. The best propaganda does not feel like propaganda. The most effective manipulation feels like your own choice. The world before and after Bernays. Before Bernays, much of advertising was direct. A company told you what a product did and why you should buy it. This soap cleans better. This car runs faster. This food costs less. The assumption was that consumers made rational decisions based on information. Bernays helped destroy that assumption. He proved that people often buy things not because of what those things do, but because of what they mean. A cigarette was not just tobacco. It was freedom. Bacon was not just food. It was health. A banana was not just fruit. It was modern nutrition. A product became a symbol. A purchase became an identity. That was Bernays' real innovation. He fused propaganda, psychology, advertising, and politics into a single system. He taught corporations to sell people versions of themselves. He taught governments to manufacture the emotional conditions under which people would consent. The invisible world we live in now. Edward Bernays lived to be 103. His wife and longtime partner, Doris Fleischman, died in 1980. Bernays spent his later years in Cambridge, Massachusetts, continuing to write, lecture, and speak about public relations. He also advocated for licensing public relations professionals, arguing that the field needed standards. The irony is hard to miss. The father of modern spin wanted quality control for the manipulation industry. But Bernays' real legacy is not in the past. It is everywhere around us. It is in political campaigns. It is in pharmaceutical ads telling you to ask your doctor. It is in influencers casually mentioning products as though they are simply sharing their lives. It is in think tanks producing research that happens to support the interests of their funders. It is in news stories planted by public relations firms. It is in social media algorithms designed not just to inform you, but to provoke a reaction and keep you engaged. The tools have changed. Bernays worked with newspapers, radio, live events, and staged publicity. Today, the same logic operates through targeted advertising, data analytics, influencer marketing, algorithmic feeds, artificial intelligence, and social media platforms. The scale is larger. The targeting is sharper. But the underlying idea is the same. Understand people's desires and fears. Attach those emotions to a product, cause, candidate, or belief. Then make the result feel like free choice. Bernays would recognize the modern world immediately. He would understand influencer marketing. He would understand native advertising. He would understand fake grassroots campaigns, now called astroturfing. He would understand manufactured expert consensus. He practiced all of it long before the internet gave those methods new power. Was Bernays right? This is the central question. Was Bernays right that the engineering of consent is necessary in a democracy? Or is it a corruption of democracy? The uncomfortable answer may be that he understood something true about human beings, but drew a dangerous conclusion from it. People are not purely rational. We are influenced by emotion, identity, habit, fear, status, and group pressure. Modern psychology has confirmed that much. But Bernays believed that because people are irrational, an elite class of experts should manage public opinion from behind the scenes. That is where his philosophy becomes dangerous. Because it never answers the most important question. Who watches the engineers? Who decides what the public should believe? Who determines whether manipulation serves the public interest or only the interest of whoever paid for it? Bernays worked for tobacco companies, consumer brands, political leaders, and powerful corporations. He applied the same methods with professional detachment, whether the result was selling soap, selling cigarettes, reshaping breakfast, or helping create support for the overthrow of a government. That is the real legacy of Edward Bernays. Not just techniques, a worldview. The belief that public opinion is something to be managed. That consent is something to be manufactured. That reality itself can be designed, packaged, and sold. The machine he built. Edward Bernays died on March 9, 1995 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His obituary called him the father of public relations. But that title may be too gentle. He was more than a publicist. He was one of the architects of the invisible world we live in now, a world where choices are shaped by forces we often cannot see, designed by people we will never meet, serving interests we may never fully understand. And the most chilling part is this. He told us exactly what he was doing. He wrote it down. He published it. He explained the machine in plain language. And then the world kept using it. So the next time you see an ad that does not look like an ad, the next time a product feels like a lifestyle, the next time a political message seems to reach you before you even know why, ask yourself one question. Is this really my choice? Or was it engineered? If this story changed the way you see the world, subscribe to the channel. Here we go deep into the hidden machinery behind money, power, persuasion, and the systems shaping everyday life. Because the world does not only run on laws, markets, and elections. It runs on stories. And the people who control the stories often control everything else.